On a cold late autumn night in 2009, in the morgue of St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester, Minnesota, a man named David, whose name has been changed, was on his night shift. David had been working this job for several years, and he was a fairly rational person who didn't believe in ghosts. To him, the morgue was just a workplace, where the deceased were temporarily kept before being taken to their final resting place. The morgue was located in the hospital's basement, a cold and silent space. The lighting here was always dim, and the air always carried a peculiar, indescribable smell. Metal refrigerators were lined up, inside which were bodies waiting to be processed. Tonight, the morgue was quite quiet. There was only the steady hum of machinery and the sound of David's footsteps as he walked around checking things. He sat at his desk, reading a book and trying to ward off the feeling of loneliness and cold that enveloped this space. Around 2 a.m., as David was focused on reading, he suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the end of the hallway. It was a very faint creak, like a door slowly opening. David stopped reading, listening intently. He was sure he hadn't misheard. The creak came again, then stopped. David thought it might just be the wind or the expansion and contraction of materials in the old building. However, a strange sense of unease suddenly rose within David. He felt as if someone was here, watching him from the darkness. He stood up, took the flashlight from his desk, and carefully walked down the hallway. His flashlight beam shone on the polished metal refrigerators, casting terrifying long shadows. When he reached the end of the hallway, David saw a small door, the door leading to the storage room. This door was usually closed, but now it was slightly ajar. David felt his heart beat faster. He was sure he had closed this door before starting his shift. Who had opened it? He slowly pushed the door open, shining his flashlight inside. The storage room was small and cluttered, with shelves full of boxes and tools. No one was there. David felt confused. Perhaps he had forgotten to close the door. He tried to reassure himself. However, as David was about to turn to leave the room, he suddenly heard another sound coming from behind a large refrigerator at the end of the hallway. It was a very faint moan, like the sound of someone in extreme pain. The moan was very faint, but in the absolute silence of the morgue, it became incredibly clear. David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He was sure it was a human moan, not the sound of machinery or wind. He cautiously walked towards the large refrigerator, shining his flashlight into the darkness behind it. The flashlight beam illuminated a small corner of the room. David didn't see anyone there. However, the moan continued, sometimes soft, sometimes a little stronger. It seemed to be coming from inside the refrigerator. David felt a cold fear spread through him. He knew that inside that refrigerator was a body. Could it be? Could it be that the spirit of the deceased was trying to contact him? David was a rational person. He didn't believe in ghosts. But what was happening was too strange to be explained by science. He tried to calm himself down. Perhaps it was just sounds coming from the body due to temperature changes or muscle rigor mortis after death. He had heard of such phenomena before. However, the moan became increasingly clear and more painful. It didn't sound like any noise he had ever heard from a body. David felt a mixture of curiosity and fear. He wanted to know what was happening. He slowly reached out his hand and placed it on the cold metal door of the refrigerator. As soon as David's hand touched the door, the moan suddenly stopped. An eerie silence enveloped the space. David felt as if someone was holding their breath, waiting. David stood there for a moment, listening, but there were no more sounds. He breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps he had imagined it all. However, as David was about to turn to go back to his desk, he suddenly heard another sound, this time coming from right beside him. It was the sound of a refrigerator drawer slowly opening. David startled and spun around. He was horrified to see a refrigerator drawer right next to him slowly sliding out. The faint light from the hallway shone into the drawer, revealing a part of the body lying inside. David felt his heart stop. He knew that no one was here but him. This drawer couldn't open by itself. He stared intently at the open drawer, his whole body stiff with fear. He tried to scream, but his throat constricted, unable to make a sound. The refrigerator drawer slowly slid all the way out, revealing the body lying inside. Under the faint light from the hallway, David was horrified to see the face of the dead man. He was an elderly man, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. What terrified David the most were the dead man's eyes. They were not empty like the eyes of a normal deceased person. In those eyes, David saw something, a coldness, a sadness, and a strange anger. It seemed the man's spirit was still lingering in the body. David stood there, unable to move, unable to take his eyes off those terrifying eyes. He felt a bone-chilling cold envelop him. He had the feeling that the man's spirit was trying to tell him something. Suddenly, the corner of the dead man's lips twitched slightly, forming a distorted and terrifying smile. Then, a faint whisper echoed from inside the drawer. "Help me!" David screamed in terror. He stumbled backward, almost falling over. He couldn't believe what he had just heard and seen. He turned around and ran frantically down the hallway, wanting to get out of this terrifying room as quickly as possible. He rushed up the stairs, not daring to look back. When he reached the ground floor, David ran to the security office and called the officer on duty. He recounted what he had witnessed, his voice trembling and full of panic. The officer on duty, a middle-aged man, looked at David with surprise and worry. He had never seen David so panicked before. However, after hearing David's story, the officer seemed skeptical. He said that perhaps David was tired from the night shift and had imagined things. He also said that ghosts didn't exist. David tried to convince the officer. He said that what he had seen and heard was real. He said that the refrigerator drawer had opened by itself and that the dead man had spoken to him. The officer still didn't believe him. He said that perhaps the drawer was broken, and the voice David heard was just due to stress. David felt disappointed. He knew that no one believed him. He knew he would have to face what was happening in the morgue by himself. Even though no one believed him, David was determined to find out the truth about the dead man in the morgue, the one who had cried for help. He believed that the man's spirit was trapped here and needed his help. David searched for information about the man in the hospital's records. His name was Robert Miller. He had passed away 2 days ago from a heart attack. The records contained no unusual information. However, David felt that something was wrong. Why couldn't Robert Miller's spirit find peace? Why was he crying for help? David began to investigate Robert Miller. He searched for information online and asked other hospital staff if they knew anything about him. He learned that Robert Miller was a lonely man with no relatives. He had lived a rather difficult life. David felt sympathy for Robert Miller. He thought perhaps the man had something he couldn't let go of, some secret that was keeping his spirit bound to this world. On his next night shift, David returned to the morgue with a sense of anxiety, but also determination. He wanted to try to contact Robert Miller's spirit again to find out more. He sat at his desk, turned on his flashlight, and spoke softly into the air. "Mr. Robert? Are you here? I want to help you." For a moment, nothing happened. The morgue was silent. David started to feel a little disappointed. However, after a while, he suddenly heard the sound of dripping water again coming from the direction of the kitchen. Just like the first night, David knew it was a sign that the spirit was nearby. David cautiously walked towards the kitchen, shining his flashlight into the darkness. As he got closer to the sink, he heard the dripping sound more clearly. It seemed to be coming from inside the sink. David looked into the sink and was horrified to see a drop of bright red liquid slowly dripping from the faucet. It wasn't water, it was blood. David screamed in terror. He stumbled backward, almost falling over. He stared intently at the drop of blood slowly dripping, unable to believe his eyes. The drop of bright red liquid continued to drip into the sink, drop by drop, creating eerie sounds in the silent kitchen. David stood there, trembling all over, unable to take his eyes off the horrifying scene. He knew it wasn't real blood. It was a supernatural phenomenon, a way that Robert Miller's spirit was trying to tell him something. David tried to calm himself down, took a deep breath, and said, "Mr. Robert, what are you trying to tell me? What happened to you?" The dripping sound stopped completely. After a moment, a faint whisper echoed in the air. Right next to David, the voice was weak and full of pain. "He took." David tried to listen more carefully, but the voice was too soft and difficult to hear. He asked, "What did he take, Mr. Robert? Please speak clearer." There was no answer. An eerie silence enveloped the kitchen. David felt disappointed, but he knew he was on the right track. Robert Miller was trying to reveal a secret. David returned to his desk, thinking about what had happened. What did he take? This phrase kept repeating in his head. David decided he would examine Robert Miller's body more closely. Perhaps there was something unusual about the body that he hadn't noticed. He went to the refrigerator where Robert Miller's body was being kept. David took a deep breath, braced himself, and slowly opened the drawer. Robert Miller's body was still lying there, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. David tried to look more closely at the body, searching for any unusual signs. He examined the entire body, from head to toe. There were no wounds, no signs of abuse. Everything seemed normal, just as in the records. However, when David examined the chest area of the body, he suddenly noticed something strange. In the area of the heart, there was a small, very faint scar, as if it had healed a long time ago. David felt a strange unease. What was this scar? Was it related to Robert Miller's death? He tried to remember if this scar was mentioned in the records, but he couldn't recall anything. Perhaps he had missed some information. David decided to check Robert Miller's records again. He took out the file and flipped through the pages. He read carefully all the reports, from the autopsy report to the medical report. In the medical report, David found a noteworthy detail. Robert Miller had undergone heart surgery a few years ago. That was the reason for the scar on his chest. However, the autopsy report stated that Robert Miller's death was due to a natural heart attack, unrelated to the scar or the previous surgery. David felt confused. If Robert Miller's death was natural, then why couldn't his spirit find peace, and why was he crying for help? And who was this he was talking about? After checking the records again, David felt even more confused. Everything indicated that Robert Miller's death was natural, but his spirit was not at peace. David believed that there was some dark secret related to Robert Miller's death. A secret he was trying to reveal. David decided to try to contact Robert Miller's spirit again. He returned to the refrigerator and said softly, "Mr. Robert, I know you're trying to tell me something. Please speak clearer. Who took something from you?" In a moment, the air in the morgue became colder. A painful moan echoed from inside the refrigerator. Then, the hoarse voice spoke again, "My heart." David startled. "Your heart? Who took your heart?" David asked, his voice trembling. Robert Miller's voice became angry and full of hatred. "He took it." "A thief." David shivered. A thief took Robert Miller's heart? That was absurd. Why would anyone take a dead person's heart? Unless he took Robert Miller's heart while he was still alive. A terrifying thought suddenly flashed through David's mind. Could it be that Robert Miller didn't die of a natural heart attack? Could it be that he was murdered? David tried to ask Robert Miller more, but his spirit seemed exhausted. His voice faded and disappeared, leaving David alone in the eerie silence of the morgue. David stood there, thinking about what he had just heard. A thief took Robert Miller's heart. He took it. He remembered the scar on Robert Miller's chest. Was that where his heart had been taken from? David knew he was facing a dark and dangerous secret. Could it be that there was some organization involved in illegal activities related to human organs? David felt scared. He didn't know what he should do. Should he report what he had heard from Robert Miller's spirit to the police? But who would believe him? David decided to find out a little more before doing anything. He would search for information about strange cases involving missing organs in this area. David began to search for information about strange cases involving missing organs in the Rochester area. He searched online, read old newspaper articles, and researched unusual medical cases. He discovered several strange cases that had occurred in recent years, involving the discovery of bodies with missing organs, especially hearts. These cases were all unsolved and seemed very mysterious. David felt a chill. He believed that these cases were related, and perhaps there was an underground organization operating, specializing in taking human organs. And perhaps Robert Miller was one of the victims of that organization. David decided to return to the morgue and try to contact Robert Miller's spirit again. He believed that Robert Miller could provide more information about the person who had murdered him. On his next night shift, David returned to the morgue. He stood in front of Robert Miller's refrigerator and called out his name. "Mr. Robert, are you here? I've been looking into other strange cases. I believe you were murdered. Please help me find out the truth." In a moment, the air in the morgue became colder. The refrigerator drawer slowly slid out. Robert Miller's body was still lying there, his eyes wide open, staring intently at David. Then, a faint whisper echoed, much clearer than the last time. "The black car license plate." David tried to remember what he heard. The black car license plate. He asked, "What is the license plate?" "Mr. Robert, please be clearer." Robert Miller's voice became weaker, as if he was trying with all his might to speak. "Number 63. The voice faded and disappeared completely. The refrigerator drawer slowly slid back in, closing shut. David stood there, thinking about what he had just heard. The black car, license plate 63. That was an important clue. David knew he had to report what he had learned to the police. Even if they didn't believe him about ghosts, they might be interested in the information about the black car and the license plate. David ran to the security office and called the police. He recounted the entire story. including that he had contacted Robert Miller's spirit and was given information about the car. This time, the police seemed more serious. They recorded David's statement and began investigating black cars with license plates starting with 63 in that area. Thanks to the information David provided, the police conducted an investigation and discovered a black car with a license plate starting with 63, registered under the name of a man with a criminal record related to illegal organ trafficking. The police arrested the man and interrogated him. At first, he denied the crime, but after the police presented the evidence they had gathered, he confessed. He confessed that he was a member of an underground organization specializing in taking the organs of lonely people or those with no relatives to sell on the black market. He and his accomplices had been following Robert Miller, who lived alone and had no one who cared about him. They broke into his house, murdered him, and took his heart to sell. He also confessed that Robert Miller did not die immediately. He had tried to resist and cry for help, but no one heard him. His spirit was trapped in his body because of his unjust death. The police conducted a deeper investigation and arrested several other members of the underground organization. The case shocked the entire country. Thanks to David's courage and perseverance, the crime was exposed, and the perpetrators were brought to justice for their brutal actions. Robert Miller was given a proper burial according to ritual. David attended his funeral, feeling a strange peace that his spirit had finally found rest. From then on, David was no longer afraid to work in the morgue. He knew that the spirits here were not scary. They were just unfortunate people who needed help. David became a believer in the spiritual world and was always ready to help lost souls. He knew that his job was not just to guard bodies but also to be a connection between the world of the living and the dead. David's story is a testament that the truth always finds a way to be revealed, no matter how well it is hidden. And sometimes, unfortunate spirits can reach out to us for help. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on the channel to follow our latest videos. We will bring you more terrifying and haunting stories. Thank you for listening.